Oh, thank you very much.
Excellent. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Teresa Pfeiffer. I'm a librarian with Dawnbreaker in upstate New York. I've had the great pleasure of working with entrepreneurs for the past 17 years as a research librarian, so it's really a pleasure to have everyone here. So let's start with some guest introductions. Joining us today for our entrepreneur and industry expert panel are Jason Osney, Philip Snow, and Eric Krohn. Deshita Dawson hopefully will be able to join us. Steve, if you give me a shout out if she comes in, that would be great.
Deshita can give herself a shout out if you like.
Hey, Deshita, welcome.
Hi, I'm here. Thank you.
Excellent. We're just starting out with intros, so it's a pleasure to have the whole team here. And do I see Eric Krohn up there as well?
Yes, hi, how are you doing?
Hi, Eric. Great. So today with us, we have Jason Osney, Deshita Dawson, Philip Snow, and Eric Krohn. Let me tell you a little bit about our crew before we dig into some questions. Jason co-founded Old Pal with Rusty Willinkin after 4 years as the co-founder of Native, a premier California cannabis brand that experienced rapid growth prior to acquisition. It was Jason's early vision that helped shape what eventually became Old Pal's lean licensing model and nationally recognized brand. Additionally, Jason is founder and chairman of Haoma, an international clean beauty line, which has recently experienced rapid growth since its inception. Pleasure to have you here with us, Jason.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Absolutely. And Deshita Dawson, chief strategist at Cannabis Health Equity Movement. Deshita is a global cannabis advocate, award-winning Fortune 100 business strategist, and best-selling author of How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry. She has 20 years business development, strategic management, and brand marketing excellence. And currently, Deshita is head of the City of Portland Cannabis Program, responsible for overseeing all regulatory, licensing, compliance, and equity initiatives for the city's cannabis industry. She also serves as chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition and chief strategist for Cannabis Health Equity Movement. Welcome, Deshita.
Thank you so much, Teresa.
Absolutely. And Philip Snow. Philip is attorney at the Kight Law Office, where he's been practicing cannabis law for 10 years after having spent the initial part of his career focusing on THC and marijuana. Philip has recently shifted his focus to hemp and other cannabinoids. He regularly advises clients on industry-specific compliance, FDA and FTC regulations, contract drafting and negotiations, as well as emerging cannabinoids. Philip, welcome.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
And Eric Krohn. Eric is a successful inventor and entrepreneur who has started multiple companies in the areas of clean tech, medical devices, hemp, and food. He leverages his vast business experience to mentor startup companies as the director of business incubation at the Koffman Incubator in Binghamton, New York. His current companies include Earnwolf, Cube Naturals, and Gyro Heat. Welcome, Eric Krohn.
Thanks. I just want to say I've never been happier to be here. #fun.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Make sure we get that in the list of puns, crew. That one's going to be in the running. Deshita, you are muted, but I think you might have had your own pun in there. Okay, you're okay. Well, we are thrilled to have the crew here and lucky that you're with us. So let's go ahead and jump right into questions. We'd love to hear more about how each one of you got started in the industry. So who's willing to kick us off?
I'll go for it. I'll take the leap of faith.
Let's do it, Jason.
Yeah. So my name's Jason Osney. I was actually a lawyer in a past life. Philip, I'm maybe we've crossed paths. I don't know, but I went to law school in New York City, and I actually moved out to California about 8 years ago now with the intent of working in a completely different industry with my law degree. And I walked into a dispensary and just realized this interesting kind of dichotomy between what was being sold and the people walking into dispensaries 8 years ago. And I thought there was an interesting opportunity to kind of implement some of the CPG practices that are obviously prevalent in other CPG industries into the cannabis space. And at that time, branding, it was even off the table. And these were the sort of things that interested me. So I created my first brand at the time called Native, which was catered to a specific demographic, which at the time was novel and exciting. And it was branded, to cater to that demographic and all of the traditional things that you think of when you think of branding and consumer packaged goods. And that went rather well, but whether it was because of the unique timing or because the brand was really exciting remains to, could be debated. But nonetheless, I ended up getting acquired and then consulting with a group called Caliva. Caliva is one of the largest cannabis companies at this point in the country. And from there, I decided that it would be interesting to kind of go back and create something on my own again. And Old Pal was what was created, and that has quickly become one of the highest volume cannabis brands in California and perhaps the country. And it's been a pretty interesting journey.
Jason, tell us a little bit about Old Pal.
Yeah, the first company that I created, Native, was a traditional vertically integrated cannabis company, meaning that it was cultivation all the way through manufactured goods, distribution, all the way to the point of retail. And what I realized is that it's really difficult in any consumer packaged goods industry to be best in class at every portion of the supply chain, distribution, manufacturing, branding, so on and so forth. So at the time I was thinking, how do we do something where our focus is tremendously, where we're tremendously focused on one thing? And that to me was brand. I believe that brand is where the value exists in most consumer packaged goods spaces. Perhaps cannabis is still quite early, and that thesis doesn't hold as much weight as it does in something like alcohol or food and beverage, but I do believe it moves in that direction. So Old Pal is a pure licensing business. We created a brand that has demand. And then we go to manufacturing partners and cultivation partners, and we offer them the ability to sell into our demand channel that we've created through that brand. So we have about 40 employees at Old Pal, and everybody is focused on creating a brand that creates demand. That way we can go to these different manufacturing partners and offer them the ability to sell into that channel. And in return for that, it's a basic royalty model. But what's interesting about cannabis is that every state is its unique industry, right? You can't build a supply chain through our licensing model in California and then go and sell to all their 50 states. So what we have to do is essentially, it's almost a franchise model where we have to go and find different franchisees in different states who will buy into this licensing model. And for us, it's interesting because it's a tremendously low burn, right? From a cash perspective, monthly cash perspective, because we're not responsible for the overhead that is cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, et cetera. We are really only focused on one portion of that supply chain. So that was a lot to probably digest, and I'm happy to answer in more detail as we go on. But that's kind of the crux of what Old Pal is as far as the business model.
That's incredibly helpful. And as librarians and information professionals, we're often asked about licensing models and royalty rates and how those negotiations transpire. So we might be circling back with you at some point, Jason, sure, for a little insight. We appreciate it. We're learning about the industry from this crew here, which is why we are incredibly appreciative that you're here to tell us your experience and what you've been through.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Dashita, tell us about your journey.
Sure, thank you so much. So I'm Dashita Dawson, and I'm also known as the Weed Head. My journey really started as a cannabis patient. I jumped into the industry informally about 10 years ago in a closeted way as an executive for Target in Minnesota before it had a medical program. My mom passed away almost 6 years ago, and I transitioned out of senior executive role in sort of traditional big CPG big retail into the cannabis space as a medical patient. And I did that in the Arizona market. And as soon as I walked into my first dispensary, I saw right away where my skill set could cross over into the industry. And that has been my journey ever since, but really with a mission to legitimize, to stabilize, and ultimately to diversify the industry. I saw that the target market was still primarily 18 to 25 white male, but yet the data, which is what we're here to discuss, was driving it towards a different demographic, largely women and women of color, and primarily women of color who are suffering from ailments like my own, which is early signs of MS, in the legal markets. And then I also saw a dearth of data coming out of what we call the legacy market, which is still a real economy. It has real supply and demand. So my trajectory of the last 5 years has really been as a strategy and management consultant. I started a firm, did so with my family. And yeah, I feel that one of the biggest challenges we had were creating valid insights and also looking for points of parity within the cannabis space that could be aligned with what I'd done in the mainstream world. Most recently in the last year, after transitioning all of that learning into a book, How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry, a workbook at that. I'm a homeschooling mom, so I really love data, workbooks, and the like. The success of it allowed me to really look at other ways to improve the industry. I got tapped by the Oregon market to oversee the legal medical and adult use market for the city of Portland, which is roughly about 40% of Oregon's market. And it has been a year ride of recognizing the importance of data, even on the government side and the lack thereof. So very excited to share more about my journey, but I think it starts really right now, it's at the intersection of business, policy, and science.
Absolutely. Dashita, you talk a lot about data and the importance of data and resources. What are your thoughts in terms of the aggregated data that's coming out, that's available to us, coming out of the analyst reports versus what you're seeing as boots on the ground, and the necessity to capture your own data and your own metrics as you go in a changing market? How does that data play out in your world?
It's interesting because sometimes the reports are still missing some of the cultural influences, and that's really important in the cannabis space. I do think that, I've relied on some of the big data companies, but coming from a world where I was used to IRI and Mintel reports, we still haven't necessarily gotten to a point where I think we have statistically significant reports that are going out on a regular basis. The delay in time usually for reporting, it can be 30 days or more. And so as a person who's trying to either advise a company on how to maneuver or make policy decisions based on what we're seeing out of other markets, there is a delay in our current structure. So it was exciting to see that there are companies like Mintel that are finally starting to really build verticals around cannabis as it gets bigger. And with New York legalizing, I feel like it's only a matter of time. It's considered to have the largest consumer market, and we need, therefore, a real, I think a real look at the consumer marketing perspective in data. And a lot of the current cannabis-only companies are really just focused largely on how you kind of invest in the industry and some of the licensing aspects, but I still feel like it doesn't really do as deep of a dive into the actual consumer markets more globally.
Okay, thank you for that. Eric, tell us what you've been up to. Tell us how you got to where you are today.
Thanks. So I'm here in New York State. So I started in hemp probably 6 or 7 years ago, well before I didn't know anyone that knew what CBD stood for, nor did I at the time. And I started with a partner of mine who was the professor here at Binghamton University, who was, I believe, in charge of the research in hemp, which made hemp legal in New York State. His background was actually from separating oil from sand up in Canada. So we had an idea to get into extraction. The sad part of the story is, unfortunately, he died very soon after that. And I swore off ever, looking into the plan again. It just didn't interest me after that. And my longtime business partner was like, Eric, he's twice my age. Eric, what is this hemp plant thing? Go look into that. Go see what are those kids doing with that? So I started to look at it, and that's when I really learned about what CBD was, and started exploring what did it do, who do you buy it from, what are the prices that people are paying. My wife at the time was working at a prison as a social worker, and I said, hey, try some of this stuff. She looked at me like I was completely crazy, and then when she returned, she talked about how the anxiety and other negative feelings that she would have working in this prison were completely gone. And that's when I knew that this was a pretty interesting, natural product to explore. So we started a brand of topicals, or at first. My partner imports olive oil from Italy. So we said, okay, look, we have this isolate, we have this olive oil, bam, stick them together. Now we got a brand. It was a lot of fun. We learned quickly, you kind of got to separate companies. If you start a brand, maybe Jason probably knows a lot more about this than I, but our retailers started getting mad that we sold it cheaper than they were able to sell it. So we ended up breaking up in the company into the brand, our own retail store, and a wholesale site. But with that said, I am actually happy to say, under good terms, that last week I exited all companies that I do have an interest involved in hemp, really for the reason of progressing my work here in New York State, mentoring cannabis companies. We're starting to get a lot of hemp and cannabis companies at our incubator, and thankfully the university is very supporting and very okay with all that. So it's I wanted to clear my record and really prepare for the future. So that's kind of as far as the cannabis world where I'm at right now.
Congratulations to you.
Thank you so much.
And kudos to you for taking on the mentorship role. It's imperative. And I would encourage all of you to not forget about your librarians, whether you pivot in the business, take it to the next level, determine maybe you're going to go to an alternative vertical within the industry. Your small business development centers, your librarians, they can help you identify the resources. You've talked about networking, you've talked about regulations in your state and industry. Often your librarians are going to be industry agnostic, but can help you identify even points of contact for the next level of customer discovery or your next stage in commercialization, helping you identify some of those resources to get you in the right direction. So never hesitate to reach out to your public or academic librarian or to this crew over here. All right, Philip, welcome.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. I'm happy to be here, and I can give you a little bit of an idea of who I am, where I came from. My name is Philip Snow. I'm an attorney at the Kight Law Office, and we are actually based out of Asheville, North Carolina. But I started my legal career back in 2011 in Denver, Colorado, when medical marijuana was just kind of getting up and off the ground, and kind of helped in the drafting of the regulations associated with medical marijuana out there, and then also helped draft the constitutional amendment in Colorado that allows for recreational use. So when we passed that in 2012 as the first state in the country, that was a pretty fun thing to be a part of. Needless to say, worked with a number of different businesses in Colorado and also across the country as well in existing and emerging markets, whether that be on the medical marijuana side of things or the recreational marijuana side of things. And now I've spent a lot of my time in the past few years due to a relocation to the Southeast, where I've been told that marijuana is the devil's lettuce. Have been spending some time working in the CBD and hemp market. So have worked with businesses of all shapes and sizes. And Jason, congratulations to you for making that pivot from being an attorney to being a businessman. So hats off to you on that one. I'm sure that was a tough decision to make, but it seems like it worked out for you. And, during my time have seen, all sorts of different regulatory environments, working with clients here in the States and then also internationally as hemp has become more and more mainstream, which I think is doing a good job of getting the cannabis foot in the door, so to speak, when it comes to regulation and showing people that regulation can actually work, as people are starting to understand that medical and recreational marijuana work for them as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Philip. Boy, there's a lot of variability regionally, isn't there? From perception to the data to changing regulations.
I just, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jason kind of shaking his head there. I'm sure he's empathizing with the fact that, it doesn't seem, a day doesn't seem to pass where there isn't a new regulation or a new state trying to change something, or, somebody else that is doing things differently than other people across the country. So it's important, and I think as librarians and people that are, I wouldn't necessarily say gatekeepers of information, but purveyors of information, to be able to provide these resources to people to know, kind of where to look for answers, where to look for resources relating to the regulations, essentially letting people know, kind of what they can and can't do, because it's something that, this is my full-time job and I still struggle to keep up with it on a daily basis.
Absolutely. You raise another good point, and I'd love to hear from our crew about this. What is your go-to resource with the industry changing so quickly, the dynamics, the regulations, new policies coming up? How do you keep your finger on the pulse of what matters?
Anybody else want this one first?
I'm happy to jump in.
Perfect.
I guess I'm just a sponge for knowledge, and I found in this field it is the most valuable and most fleeting thing I've ever tried to possess. But a big one is social media. So LinkedIn, there's everybody in cannabis is in LinkedIn, and there's also some really excellent retired CEOs that comment on it a lot. But great to follow businesses or consultants or other things on there. Businesses, if you follow businesses on Instagram or other things like that, it's very interesting to see what they're marketing and whom they're marketing it to, or how they're marketing it. In New York State, the only way to stay one step ahead is to just read the bill as soon as they release it, or to get your hands on it before it's released, so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. But then you have the pitfall that every word that's in the bill, it's usually not defined, so it doesn't get defined until the marijuana office actually picks it up and decides what it means. And then lastly, and the best one is get out of the office and talk to people. So again, somehow I've helped facilitate bringing a lot of hemp companies to Binghamton. But the knowledge you get from talking to all of them and learning about what problems they're facing, that's unbelievably valuable. But it's somewhere that mix of all that stuff, I think is my answer.
Yeah, I'll chime in. From the perspective of Old Pal, the first step for us is kind of just looking at the regulatory landscape in a state, from afar, and asking the simple question of, are our SKUs allowed there, right? For instance, New York, for the longest time, you couldn't sell flower, right? It was only different forms of ingestible or vaporizing. So that was obviously off the table. So the first step is looking at the states that have either medical or recreational cannabis and saying, okay, these are states we can at least exist in. The next step is to find a partner in those states who we feel are truly up to date on the regulatory landscape of their specific geography. And then going in there and having our packaging team go in there and figure out all the packaging regulations around the products that are actually allowed in those states, right? And then the messaging that we can use around the brand from a marketing perspective. So I think from our perspective, there's 3 regulatory things we're looking at. One is the ability to launch a SKU in that state. Second is the packaging regulations. And then 3 is the marketing and messaging that we're allowed to put out into the, so for instance, in Michigan, you can't use the name of anything that would potentially cater to children. Makes a lot of sense, obviously. In California, you can't have anything in the SKU name that is any city or county in California unless it's actually grown in that county. These are obscure, bizarre regulations that are different from state to state, and they're endless. So you do the best you can. And to us, that's kind of the 3-step process we go through is, again, SKU, ability to launch the SKU in that state. What does the packaging regulations look like? And then what is the messaging we can put behind the commercialization of that SKU? And then after that, it's going to change. Every 6 months it changes, and you have to go back and you have to bring the team in and you have to figure out how to, refinagle your messaging in that state. And that's the battle that is cannabis. And that's why people fail. Honestly, it's expensive. It's really expensive to stay up to date with the regulatory landscape. And, that's a big reason we decided to do the licensing model is we didn't think it was even literally physically possible from a bandwidth or financial perspective to stay up to date with all the cannabis regulations across not only the United States, but Canada, and eventually as you look international. So we put that on the partners. We'll provide the resources to get the brand into your state, but it's your job to make sure you are being compliant. It seems to me like the only viable way to do it, unless you have $100 million cash flow to go and spend the time to do that, which some people do, and they're doing a great job.
Not most entrepreneurs, Mr. J.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yep.
Exactly.
It's so true, though. Words of wisdom there. Putting that team together and identifying the roles and responsibilities is key.
Right.
Dashita, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly add that as an entrepreneur in this particular space, because it's just being built, while I definitely am, utilize early out the gate a lot of the same methodology, and they're probably still, if you're first kind of digging in, you want to check out what's happening on social media. LinkedIn is lit when it comes to cannabis right now. But I also believe in being a thought leader as well, and writing the laws yourself and participating in the policy making as an entrepreneur. There's still a lot of bro science and fear latent within our policies and regulations and in our marketing. There's a lot of lexicon changes that are currently happening now. For example, New York is one of the first bills to not call their adult use market recreational, and we're starting to see that transition. There's also probably one of the first markets to also have hemp cannabinoids all in one office of cannabis management. Those are the type of significant changes that I think both Jason and Eric talk about happen every 3 to 6 months, which is probably why my workbook is on the 3rd edition. But it also it's being changed by the people who are part of the industry and the entrepreneurs who are leading the way. Really re-educating legislators and policymakers because they don't know. And then 2, also bringing along sort of, again, the culture and the community that already exists in each particular market to start to drive sort of the conversation. I believe in being a contributor. So if you are someone who is, finding your way through the cannabis space, that became a contributor for Entrepreneur very early out the gate, to give that lens of here's the data we have, here's my thought and analysis around it, because you can have data all day, but if you don't have someone who's synthesizing and providing the insights, which I think librarians also do well, I think you will struggle with developing the strategy as well.
Dashita, you wear a number of hats. When it comes to developing the strategy in the industry, how different is it for you when you're working for state and fed under that city hat versus you as a business entrepreneur?
In truth, I made this public move strategically. I had at that point worked with a lot of large multi-state operators, various business types and municipalities. So I was educating lawmakers and even law enforcers. And I had an incident in Wisconsin educating law enforcement there. And a month in, I was detained myself because apparently the hotel we were in smelled like cannabis. That being said, I felt like immediately after that, more of the work that I needed to do was a public-private partnership, particularly as it pertains to cannabis equity, which was missing in all of the mature markets. It's missing in Oregon still, and one of the things that we're working towards. And that's, again, where information has been a bit of a dearth of, like, where do we get it? And I want to, shout out just ACLU for publishing reports. They had a recent one in 2020 that gave a lot of racial disparity data, a lot of information about the birth of this industry. And that, to me, should drive the direction of the government. So my crossover to the public sector has been strategic, but I am still working with a lot of great brands that understand cannabis equity, understand cannabis dynamics, both on the legacy side and the legal side, and are informing us better about how we create policies.
Excellent. There's so much to understand.
One thing,
Another question.
if I may just jump in really quickly,
Absolutely,
Teresa.
Philip. Absolutely.
One thing that I would add to everybody's point, because I think everybody made wonderful mentions of kind of how to constantly stay up to date on this ever evolving landscape, is, your local regulating body, whether that be your local licensing department on the city level, whether that be the State Department of Agriculture, whether that be, the State Department of Health in some instances is responsible for regulating these programs. Generally speaking, they allow you to subscribe to their listservs, or they allow you to subscribe to their updates. And while it might seem kind of silly and antiquated, they do a pretty good job of updating people on those. So if you don't have the time, or, as Jason well pointed out, you don't have the bandwidth, or you don't have the manpower to allocate to this, to be scouring these resources on a regular basis, putting your name on a listserv never hurts, because essentially you are easily allowed to get access to that information. And, I know librarians, just like everybody else on the meeting today, wears, very different hats on a regular basis. So that's kind of a fail-safe way of knowing if and when things change.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. We have an audience here, remember, of librarians and information professionals. What is your advice to us? What can we do better to help serve you? Is it about resources? Is it about networking?
I definitely think the network is important, but it's also about relying less on what you think you know about cannabis, right? Like I was part of board Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. We talked a lot about how many times when we are seeing things, the doctors revert to when the last time they had cannabis or they used weed or whatever, and it's the college time period. And I'm like, that's not the brain I want you to put on this. What I need you to put on this is that, we are learning so much more. There's a lot of international data coming out of Israel, Germany, and Canada. And I do think that we're behind because of the Schedule I designation. We're just behind on the knowledge. And so really being curious about cannabis and recognizing that hemp is cannabis too. Hemp competency is cannabis competency in some ways. And because of the federal legality there, and I think Eric alluded to this as well, there's a lot more room for you to get that foot in the door around getting cannabis related materials and or information. My background, I'm a molecular biologist by training. So when it comes down to it, especially hemp cannabinoids, I could make the same products with high THC marijuana. And so I do think at the end of the day, there's some overlap, but it's missing because of the trifurcated regulatory system. So don't be fooled by that. Start with the science. And I think you'll be, as librarians and information specialists, you'll be able to provide more information faster to entrepreneurs as well.
Yeah, very helpful. Do you think that, no, go ahead.
I was just going to piggyback on Nishita's point. I think that was a very well made point, because I think that the United States, as she well said, is so far behind or so antiquated in its views. And we still very much live in this reefer madness mentality where cannabis is supposed to be such a taboo thing. Certain people will gravitate towards it because they realize the tax revenue that can be generated from it. Generally speaking, people will gravitate towards medical when they know someone or have personally experienced the benefits of it firsthand. But I think, as Dashita said, be open to it. And I think that if you don't have this prohibitionist mentality towards it, it's going to allow you to find information beyond, that first click or that first resource or whatever the case may be. And that's going to allow them, as being a repository of information, to kind of act as a better custodian of that information. And they're going to be able to pass it on to people much easier and much more frequently if they just have an open mind. Certainly, there's people out there that don't use it, that don't consume it, but, may have seen the benefits of it firsthand, or, someone in their family, whatever the case may be. But I think if you encourage people to have an open mind to it and to say, generally speaking, when people approach cannabis, from a medical perspective, it's their last resort. It's not the first thing that people go to. So I think that open mind is going to be a very huge, takeaway, if I could say so.
Yeah, to that point, when we look for, new talent, generally, particularly if we're pulling them from universities, it's us versus tech, it's us versus finance, it's us versus law, right? And so the best talent, that young talent in America right now, I don't think cannabis is even in the equation. I don't even think it's right. It's still too taboo. And that is the paradigm shift that needs to happen, because if that paradigm shift happens today in US universities, I think that really expedites, national recognition of this as being a viable opportunity or career path, in 10 years. And I think that happens, right now, if I'm looking, for a COO, not a COO, but someone for operations, I'm looking at somebody probably from the beverage space, the alcohol space, the food and beverage space. I'd like to see in 10 years that we're pulling from other cannabis companies, right? And that's just not really on the table today, because I don't think it has been accepted as an okay career path yet.
So I have a slightly different ask. I think that's what we're doing here. What I would love, and hopefully my mentees also, if I've taught them anything, is I need someone to follow the money. And I think if through the research libraries, there must be a way to get the data, but who's spending money on these products? Where are they spending money on these products? How much of these products are they buying? How often? What is the politics of the town that they're buying in? There's so much you can find out if you just track the money. And a lot of the downfalls I'm seeing locally is companies that don't scale to the size that will make them successful. But if they had only saw where the money was going, perhaps they wouldn't invest, or perhaps they would invest in whatever they have to do for that next step. In my eyes, if you could have a heat map of all these different variables and be able to say that that's the data, I think that at least I would want, because it moves an idea from uncertainty to certainty. And it's very hard to get that stuff.
Absolutely, and especially in the nascent mobile markets, it may be a case, Eric, for securing funding to conduct the kind of local needs assessments needed to aggregate that kind of data. If it's not there, because they're going to look at the regional need and players. So that could be next step in terms of developing your own local heat map. But you're right. Where's the need coming from, and follow the money trail from there. If anyone can make the argument for it, it's this crew right here.
I would also just say I completely agree, but do not forget the money trail that is the legacy market. I'm a New Yorker, Brooklyn born, so I'm so excited that New York has legalized, because you do not create an estimated $4 billion market without consumers that are without supply. And whether we understand fully, what is being bought, I'll be real, as an Oregon regulator, I still see Oregon product in New York. So we understand what's happening. We need to be more, real about what's happening, and it shouldn't be as much of a we don't talk about it, especially as we get big markets like New York. The only way New York is really going to win is not necessarily following exactly how the money has worked in like Colorado and Oregon, or oh my gosh, even Washington. These are markets that I think still are going back and fixing things, following the money that brought you to this conversation, which is quote unquote the largest underground cannabis market in the world. And so what does that look like? And I think New York is creating an environment that will allow information specialists to do that type of research, and more individuals coming out the quote unquote closet to say, hey, I participate, I'm a legacy consumer. I'll just say the last thing we did at an event recently that was sponsored by Weedmaps, for example, great information site that has all this data. And one of the really important things that we did was collect data, and we asked questions like, do you shop in the legacy market? These are the things that I think we have to start the shift on to augment what we're learning in the legal market, because you'll make mistakes if you just follow the legal market. Because again, we can't forget that dynamics that's there already, that's existing in the legacy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
There's 3 minutes remaining, so this might be a good time to take questions from the audience.
Absolutely. Ophelia, would you do me a favor and send us over some of the questions from the audience?
Yes, so we have a lot of comments actually, and the comments are on the importance of advocacy and staying up to date, which the panelists have emphasized so much. But the question that we have is whether anyone on the panel thinks that the SAFE Act will pass in the Senate.
No.
No, probably not.
No, not yet.
Nope. I'm not trying to diminish what's trying to be done on Capitol Hill in Washington, but quite frankly, I just don't think we're there yet. As much as I would like to say that the world is ready for this, I just realistically think that we're still a year or two away. Other people on the panel might disagree with me, but I think that we are at least a year or two away from broad sweeping federal change when it comes to cannabis, and I'm not even going to touch the topic of legalization on the federal level. I'm just going to leave it at the SAFE Act right now. But unfortunately, and I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think it's going to happen immediately. No.
Thank you. And we are closing in on the end of our hour, and I want to thank you all again so much for being here. Remember, your librarians are your team members, and we're here as your resources, and you have been fabulous today with providing us. Is it okay if additional individual questions come in, if we send those over to you? Okay, wonderful, thank you. Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Teresa, and thank you everyone on the panel.
Thank you, everybody.
That was excellent. We appreciate your time and your engagement, enthusiasm, and your knowledge. So we appreciate that very much. We are in a 10-minute break looking at my notes real quick, at 3:10. Morgan is going to lead or moderate the librarian short talks, starting off with Tim Tully. So we're going to have a 10-minute break. And librarians who are speaking, if you want to start setting up for that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, everyone will take a 10-minute break. Thank you very much. Well done, Teresa.
And for the librarians who are signing up for the next session, I'm here. So if you need anything, just shout out to me. But yeah, looking forward to your talks at 3:10.